Sarah was starting over. After a painful breakup and a move to a small town to escape the painful reminders of her old life, she was feeling lonely and needed companionship. She decided to visit the local animal shelter, hoping a pet might lift her spirits. She arrived at the shelter and noticed one dog that seemed different from the others. A shaggy black dog with deep, soulful eyes that seemed to hold secrets. He was an older dog, quiet and reserved, named Shadow. As she reached out to pet him, Shadow seemed to watch her intently, almost as if he recognized her. The shelter workers seemed relieved she was interested in adopting him. One of them mentioned that Shadow had been found wandering near the forest's edge, and no one knew where he came from. There were vague stories about him being seen in the same area of the woods for years, as if he were waiting for someone. Feeling a strange connection with Shadow, Sarah decided to take him home. As she drove away, she noticed the staff watching her from the shelter's entrance, murmuring to one another, though she couldn't make out what they were saying. At first, things were peaceful. Shadow followed her around the house, a silent but steady companion. However, within a few days, Sarah noticed odd behaviors. Shadow would sometimes stand still in the middle of the room, staring at nothing with his hackles raised. Other times, he would whimper at night, his gaze fixed on dark corners of the house. He avoided certain rooms altogether, and no matter how much Sarah tried, he refused to go near the basement. One night, Sarah woke to the sound of scratching at her bedroom door. She opened it, expecting to see Shadow, but the hallway was empty. When she returned to bed, Shadow trotted in from the living room, growling softly as he watched something over her shoulder. As days passed, the odd occurrences escalated. When they went on walks, Shadow would sometimes stop and refuse to move, staring into the distance with a tense, defensive posture. Sarah often felt like she was being watched, an unsettling feeling that she couldn't shake. Then, a neighbor mentioned to her that Shadow had been seen wandering near the woods for years. The comment unsettled her. She didn't understand how the dog could have survived alone for so long. One brisk autumn afternoon, Sarah decided to take Shadow for a walk near the woods. She was curious about his past and hoped to learn more by exploring where he'd been found. The forest was dense and seemed darker than it should be. The trees twisted in odd shapes, their bark scarred with strange symbols. The path was covered in fallen leaves, muffling her steps. After walking for some time, they came upon an old cabin that she hadn't noticed before. The cabin was surrounded by bones hanging from trees, and strange symbols were carved into the doorframe. A chill ran down her spine, but she couldn't look away. Shadow began growling, his eyes locked on the cabin door, his fur standing on end. Before Sarah could move, she felt the presence of something watching them. A dark shape moved among the trees, barely visible but undeniably there. Shadow tugged on his leash, pulling her away from the cabin, and she hurried after him, her heart pounding. Once they were back on the main trail, Sarah glanced back, but the cabin had vanished. Only an empty clearing remained where it had stood. From that night onward, the strange happenings in her house became more pronounced. Footsteps echoed in the hallway late at night, even though she was alone. Doors opened and closed on their own, and the whispers she had brushed off as wind became louder, more insistent, like voices trying to communicate. Shadow became increasingly agitated, barking at seemingly empty spaces. At times, he would stand in front of her bedroom door, growling at something only he could see, refusing to let her pass. One night, she woke up to find Shadow at the foot of her bed, staring intensely at the wall behind her. Her blood ran cold as she realized his eyes were fixed on a shadow, a tall, indistinct figure with hollow eyes that seemed to burn with a faint red light. She froze, barely daring to breathe. As the figure moved toward her, its gaze fixed on her. Shadow lunged, barking and snapping his teeth, and the figure vanished. But Sarah could feel its presence linger, a cold weight in the air that left her shaken and terrified. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah returned to the animal shelter, hoping the staff might have answers. After some hesitation, one of the workers admitted the truth. Shadow wasn't an ordinary dog. Years ago, he'd been found near the same cabin, standing beside the decayed remains of his former owner, a man rumored to have practiced dark rituals in the forest. No one knew the full story, but there were whispers of a curse, something the man had summoned that had never left the woods. Shadow was believed to have witnessed or been part of this ritual and had somehow survived, though he was never the same. The staff member confided that strange things often happened around Shadow, and they had been relieved to see him go. With a sinking feeling, Sarah realized that Shadow had been protecting her all along. The entity haunting her wasn't after Shadow, it was after her, drawn by the residual energy from the cabin, and it was growing stronger every night. Desperate to break the curse, Sarah planned to return to the cabin with Shadow. She gathered a few supplies, including a charm she had bought from a mystic in town, and set off at nightfall. Shadow walked beside her, tense but resolute, as they made their way through the darkened forest. The cabin was there this time, standing as if waiting for her. Inside, she found the remnants of an old ritual, circles of symbols drawn in chalk on the floor, and the smell of decay. Shadow growled, his gaze fixed on a corner of the room, where the shadowy figure emerged once again. It was larger and more menacing than before, its eyes burning with a terrible light. Sarah remembered the words she had learned for the ritual, and, holding the charm tightly, she began to speak them aloud. The figure howled in rage, lunging at her, but Shadow leapt in between them, barking fiercely. As she completed the incantation, the figure let out an unearthly scream, and Shadow bit down on it with all his might. There was a blinding flash of light, and when it faded, both Shadow and the shadowy figure were gone. The following weeks were quiet, the house feeling lighter and free from the oppressive darkness that had haunted it. Though she missed Shadow deeply, Sarah knew he had saved her. She often thought about the sacrifice he had made and how he had always tried to protect her from the evil lurking in the forest. Then, one cold evening, she heard a familiar scratching at her door. Opening it, she found herself staring at a faint, ghostly image of Shadow, his form barely visible but unmistakable. He looked at her with the same deep, soulful eyes that had first drawn her to him. Sarah knelt, feeling a warmth spread through her, as she realized that Shadow hadn't left her completely. He was watching over her, even in death. From then on, Shadow's spirit remained by her side, a silent guardian protecting her from the dark presence that might one day return.